Good evening, everyone. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as director of Roosevelt House on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you for what we think will be a very special evening in a very special week that's been devoted to Franklin Roosevelt and his contemporaries. And it's all happening as we approach a milestone for what we like to call our sacred space. As some of you know, I hope you all know, November marks the 75th anniversary of the day that the Roosevelt family officially turned this house over to Hunter College. At a ceremony on the main campus to which FDR had committed himself to attend, he had a slight conflict, the Tehran conference with Churchill and Stalin. For some unknown and indefensible reason, he chose the summit over our event. And in a very interesting side story, he nearly paid for that decision with his life. He was on board the USS Iowa, steaming across the Atlantic toward Tehran, and the Navy decided to show him a torpedo drill with dummy torpedoes. Well, one submarine torpedo man let loose a live torpedo toward the USS Iowa. Roosevelt was on deck. He was on, Chris, I never know this. He was on the right. The torpedo was coming on the starboard, right? Left. So he was on the port, and he said to his valet, "Quick, get me to the starboard side. I want to see the torpedo." I would have said help, but he said that. He was wheeled to the starboard side, and the torpedo just went past the bow of the ship. The man who had done the unthinkable was court-martialed and convicted and sentenced to, whatever you call it, expelled from the Navy, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. And Roosevelt, who was not told about the proceedings, found out about it and pardoned him and commuted the sentence. That's what happened. But the main story was Eleanor came here and handed over the deed to Roosevelt House, and it has been going strong as a Hunter institution ever since. I say this not only because we're really just a week and a half from the actual anniversary, but because I want to draw your attention to the event we're having on November 27th to mark that event. I know it's unusual in that it's a fundraising event, but we really need to do that to sustain our public programs. So I hope you will come. Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel, who is here tonight, is the co-chairman of the event, and Doris Kearns Goodwin will be our speaker on leadership in turbulent times. So we've left you the folders, and that's the flyers, and that's the end of my commercial for the day. We are delighted to look back to a period a little bit before the transfer of the House, to the period in the 1920s when Franklin Roosevelt and Al Smith were colleagues, and examine that relationship. Some of that relationship was cemented in this house, and that's a cue for a photograph I'd like to throw up on the screen. There is FDR and Al Smith in the library upstairs, conferring in the old incarnation of the library. We don't know, maybe Terry will be able to tell us at what stage that the relationship was when this picture was taken. Kind of hard to tell. But you all know that library, which I speak of often, is the place where the transition took place between 1932 and 1933. It was the transition headquarters. And of course, it's where Frances Perkins announced that she would not accept a cabinet position unless Governor Roosevelt committed to extend the old age pensions program he had begun in Albany by committing to a federal program. And FDR, who I believe in 25 years in this house never uttered the word no, said, of course. So we are in the birthplace of Social Security, and it's always good to remember that. I know you're as excited as I am that Terry Galway is here to talk about each and both of these extraordinary New Yorkers, one born in a tenement on the Lower East Side and one in a country estate at Hyde Park. one the 4-time governor of New York, the other the 2-time governor, one an unsuccessful candidate for president, and the other elected to the presidency 4 times. And we couldn't have a more engaging and accomplished biographer to tackle these stories. Terry Galway was the city editor of the New York Observer. I guess that's where we really knew each other from. Right around the corner. Before that, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, and we are delighted that another alum of the New York Times editorial board, our Board of Advisors member Dorothy Samuels, is here, as well as Tony Stepansky, who is also a member of our board. And since then, he's been a senior editor at Politico. He's a vivid chronicler of New York political history, Irish American history, the author of such books as JFK Day by Day, Washington's General Nathanael Greene, and the Triumph of the American Revolution. So Others Might Live, a history of New York's bravest, and that deals with our fire department heroes. Full of Grace, a biography of John Cardinal O'Connor, and I love this title. I've always loved this title. Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. So the natural follow-up to that just had to be Frank and Al, FDR, Al Smith, and the unlikely alliance that created the modern Democratic Party. The New York Times has called the book History Told the Old-Fashioned Way, an adroit narrative full of heroes, vivid scenes, and plentiful anecdotes. It sounds irresistible. I was taken with the fact that the Times added that it was no longer than it absolutely had to be. No one has ever said that about my book, so I'm very envious. Always leave them clamoring for more. The editor is here. We can talk to her and get some advice. So it's a terrific read. And we're really thrilled that Kevin Baker is here to be the interlocutor. Kevin is a novelist and nonfiction writer, the author of Sometimes You See It Coming, his City of Fire trilogy, and Paradise Alley, Strivers Row. And I've known of Kevin ever since his days at American Heritage. So it's good to have these two magazine and newspaper guys here to talk about history. So I'll make my usual plea. I know someone is going to ignore me, but I'm going to try again. Please turn off all devices that make noise, because I promise you something will go off. And we are recording this for YouTube, for our students who turn to these broadcasts at their own time afterwards. Kevin will lead the discussion, and we'll have time for a Q&A. During the Q&A, please wait for the microphone so we can record for our students. And after that, you are all invited upstairs for a reception and a book signing. Book sales are mandatory for a glass of wine. And with that, let me turn it over to our special guests, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much for joining us here at Roosevelt House, really a terrific institution in the city of New York. And yes, the doors will be locked until you buy a book. So I just want to say briefly that I also worked for a while at the New York Observer. I had a column there and had the great honor of being fired by Jared Kushner. So I still take delight in that. So just to say, starting off, this is a terrific book, a lyrical book, really a wonderful job of getting across a historical moment and two epic figures in a very readable way, while making some vital and intelligent points about them. Frank and Al takes up a discussion that Terry and I have been having off and on for years now, which is about just what the role was of the political machine in building American democracy. And of all the machines, and pretty much every city of the time had one, some had two, Tammany Hall was really the greatest, the most powerful, the most difficult to kill, the most inventive, and the most loathed and feared. So, what was the machine's greatest contribution to American democracy?
Well, that's a loaded question. I would say well, Tammany's greatest contribution to New York was Al Smith and Bob Wagner. I mean, imagine New York politics without either one of them. And they were proud sons of Tammany. You know, there was never any point where they said, no, I've risen above that now, I'm not. They were members of Tammany Hall until they died. I suppose that the greatest contribution to of machine politics, and there were many negatives, but one of the contributions was that people voted, right? I mean, they got people to vote, sometimes more than once, but they got people interested. Do you know, there's a great, one of the great movies about machine politics, of course, is The Last Hurrah with Spencer Tracy. And at one point, Spencer Tracy is describing politics to his nephew, who's a sports writer, which is how I started. And he said, he says, what's the greatest spectator sport in America? And his sports writer nephew says, horse racing, college football? He says, no, politics. Here's the thing, machine politics was a participant sport, not a spectator sport. And, Charlie Murphy, who raised both, Charlie Murphy was the boss of Tammany Hall, loathed by reformers. He was the man who plucked Bob Wagner and Al Smith out of obscurity as young people and said, you will be the new face of Tammany, you will lead the state legislature. Charlie Murphy used to stand on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 22nd Street by his bar and listen to his constituents come by and hear their complaints and try to resolve them. And that's when he was a district leader in the Gas House District, which is now where Peter Cooper Village and Stuyvesant Town are. If you didn't vote by 3 o'clock, you got a handwritten note from Charlie Murphy, and it wasn't a threat. Well, I mean, we, of course, haven't seen those notes. I suspect no one kept them, but I don't think there was any implied threat. It was, don't forget to vote. Right? Now, he didn't probably send them to somebody he thought would vote Republican. That's what I'm guessing, right? But he knew how to bring out his people. And I think that was a real contribution, particularly by the way, when Tammany Hall was a power in New York, you didn't see voter turnouts like you do now, except maybe, of course, for last Tuesday. But, voter participation has declined. We know that. Tammany was all about getting as many votes as you can by any means necessary.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point, too, that they also really recruited talent.
Yes.
They wanted you to take part in the democracy, and they were out looking for guys who would make good candidates, who would be good workers. It's an interesting part of that. So the partnership of Al Smith of Oliver Street with Franklin Delano Roosevelt of Hyde Park reached beyond the machine and across class and ethnic lines. And this sort of partnership, this hybrid, this pragmatism, I think, was how our politics worked best back when it used to work at all.
Yeah, well, there's no question, I think, that one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt learned from people like Al Smith and from Tammany Hall, and, frankly, where I think this book is counterintuitive, I like to think, and challenges the FDR narrative, is that many of his biographers, understandably so, will say that Franklin Roosevelt resigned from the state Senate in 1913 to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy, like his cousin, and went to Woodrow Wilson's progressive, although not so progressive, Washington, right? And learned progressive politics and learned the art of politics in Washington, watching Wilson and all of these other people like William Gibbs McAdoo and others. And I disagree. I feel that Roosevelt, FDR, learned the art of practical politics by watching the people he was surrounded by in New York. And that meant Tammany Hall, and that meant Al Smith, and that meant Charlie Murphy, who set a certain level of expectation, who were very pragmatic, perhaps in some people's minds too pragmatic, but they did get things done. And I think FDR learned from that, as opposed to, frankly, some of the reformers in Wilson's administration who were maybe a little too high-minded and not compromising. And as a result, I mean, this is the kind of argument that the current governor of New York makes all the time, right? That he is the guy who can get things done, that you can talk all you want about ideology and ideals, all of which are good, but at a certain point, things have to get done. I mean, that was basically his reelection message this past year, and it appears to have succeeded.
That's a great point about terminology too, because I saw in the paper today both the governor and Mayor De Blasio making the same points about their progressive pragmatists, and I always cringe a little when I see that word progressive, which we're all supposed to use nowadays because liberals so terrible. Progressives, though, were a very mixed bag. I mean,
Yes,
they were
they
for
right.
involuntary sterilization. They were for stopping immigration. They're for prohibition. All things that didn't work very well. Really, what, in a way, would you say that really FDR and Al Smith invent what's called liberalism?
Yes, I would agree. I think that at one point in the book, I say, and by the way, fair play to my editor Elizabeth, who's here, who turned what has been praised as a book of good length. Well, it wasn't like this when I turned it in, let me tell you. So thank you, Elizabeth Eibesgard, who turned what was 180,000 words into what is now about 100,000. But in any case, I think that that FDR learned about FDR and Al Smith invented sort of lunch bucket liberalism, which replaced progressivism, which had its ugly side. Woodrow Wilson, the great progressive, segregated the federal workforce. As far as I understand, that's not progressive.
Yeah, there was a lot of white supremacy in it, and after a while, you read it, almost everybody became a progressive. Like Calvin Coolidge was describing himself as a progressive.
Yes.
Yeah. But you use the very vivid and effective metaphor of the Hudson River
Yes.
for this partnership, which both men grew up alongside. The East River, technically not its own river, and which coincidentally begins to change in nature very near where Hyde Park is. And if you could read that passage for us, I think
Sure.
it's the terrific metaphor there.
Well, thanks. One of the things that I tried to do in the book, and it took a novelist and a good editor to notice, is that, I tried to give some sort of vivid imagery and even symbolism to the book. So one of the things I know, of course, the story of Al Smith, we all know, he grew up by the Brooklyn Bridge, and that's such a part of his life. I may have stretched it a bit, but if you go to Hyde Park, and if you haven't been there, why not? Please go and go often. There's also a bridge that was built during Franklin Roosevelt's childhood. It was a railroad bridge. It's now called the Walkway over the Hudson. But it, too, was a marvel of its time. It was the longest rail bridge in the world. So I took that as, see where I'm going here, right? Frank and Al is a bridge, right? Crossing a divide between the party. So, but I also thought the river was also an interesting metaphor as a, because it's, well, you'll see, I'll read it. In the dry seasons of the late 19th century, salt water from New York Harbor churned upstream from lower Manhattan to a bend in the Hudson River north of Poughkeepsie called Crum Elbow. There, brine from the harbor mixed with the clear water flowing south from the pristine streams in the Adirondack Mountains to form something not quite seawater, but not quite fresh water either. And I found that through my wonderful access to the archives of the New York Times. And if you're not reading that, why not? But because I thought that that's what Frank and Al were all about. You know, it was the city and the country coming together, these two wings of the Democratic Party that didn't speak to each other, basically. But these two characters sort of come together to create something that hadn't existed before. That is a Democratic Party in which a sort of a traditional progressive like FDR and an urban lunch bucket liberal like Al Smith could come together and find a common interest, which is where I think the modern Democratic Party was created.
Yeah, and you get the feeling early on in Roosevelt's career in the state Senate that he very much feels he has to kind of distance himself from Tammany, that he almost goes out of his way to pick a fight, which he probably would have had to do for his constituents, right, to be seen as having any integrity.
Sure. As a state senator, he was representing Dutchess, Columbia, and a third county, which is now escaping me, but maybe part of Putnam, maybe Rensselaer. I said it the Albany way, Rensselaer. But he was representing, rural constituents who looked at all of the immigrants in the city, all of these Catholics and Jews who were coming into New York and voting for machines and doing all these horrible things, the rural constituents that Roosevelt represented in the state Senate would have looked with great contempt for these city characters. They were crooks. They were people like Big Tim Sullivan, who ran rackets in the Bowery, and Roosevelt could certainly not run as an ally of them. And mind you, he is not a natural ally. That's what makes, I think, this story so interesting, is that no one in 1911 would have predicted that Franklin Roosevelt would nominate Al Smith for president, not once but twice, and would put at the head of the Democratic National Committee in 1940 Ed Flynn, who was a protege of Charlie Murphy and a creature of Tammany Hall. Like, that was not, no one saw that coming in 1911.
And is it really the FDR's failed Senate primary bid in 1914 that convinces him he needs Tammany?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that when he makes the change?
Right. Yeah, so FDR lost, he was, and one of the things that I noticed in going through the records at the FDR Library, which is one of my favorite activities, I wish I could make a living doing that, but one of the things that I learned that I didn't know was in the minute he got to Washington, FDR, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was looking for his next move, right? He was an ambitious fellow. Right? He was a politician. And he jumps into the Senate race in 1914. This is the first primary that New York is, first of all, it's the first popular election that New York has for the United States Senate, and it's also the first primary, which he was a great champion of as a progressive. So he runs thinking, all right, let's see what Tammany's got. Let's see what you're going to do. And Charlie Murphy nominates Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to Germany as Franklin Roosevelt's opponent. And James Gerard says, well, I'm the ambassador. I couldn't possibly campaign. So Roosevelt is going around the state campaigning against a ghost who also is a Wilsonian, is brilliant. And he lost in a landslide. And I think he learned, those guys at Tammany Hall are smart.
They know what they're doing. And the period Frank and Al covers was really when New York State and New York City were at their zenith compared to the rest of the country in terms of wealth, in terms of population, in terms of ideas. New York, by the 1936 presidential election, had 47 electoral votes to just 22 for California. Now it's almost exactly the reverse, 55-29. So what New York was going to be was going to have a huge effect on the rest of the country and on the rest of the world at this point. This really is a laboratory of democracy.
Absolutely, and it's also a laboratory of presidential candidates. In an unedited version of the story, I go into how, because these two New Yorkers become governor, and I go into the fact that back then, if you were the governor of New York, you were de facto a national candidate. And if you look just in the 20th century alone, the first half of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, Charles Evans Hughes, Al Smith, FDR, Thomas Dewey, and there's 5 New Yorkers who ran for president, just between 1904 and 1944. And in the late 19th century, Grover Cleveland, right? The list of New York governors who ran for president, Samuel Tilden, who was robbed out of the presidency in 1876. So that was my point, was that Albany, was a laboratory for presidential candidates. And so that, and Al Smith, of all of them, Al Smith is the most unlikely.
Yeah, and probably the most successful in running the
As
state.
governor, yes.
Although they were all contributed something. And you're right here, yeah, New York politics at the dawn of the Roaring '20s featured the names of officials grand and minor who would be well remembered in the histories of the 20th century. There were the big names, the stars, Al Smith, Franklin Roosevelt, Francis Perkins, Robert Wagner. There was a supporting cast, James Farley, Edward Flynn, Belle Moskowitz. And there were the understudies, Robert Moses, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Jimmy Walker, and a young congressman named Fiorello LaGuardia. And then you also mentioned that ever-aspiring politician, William Randolph Hearst. And really, in the full era that your book covers, there were even more. There was Theodore Roosevelt Sr., of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, Charles Evans Hughes, who becomes the Chief Justice of the United States, Herbert Lehman, Thomas Dewey, Samuel Seabury, Wendell Willkie, who lived here, Robert Jackson, Averil and Mary Harriman, Emmanuel Seller, Caroline O'Day, Ferdinand Pecora, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Sidney Hillman, David Dubinsky, Dorothy Day, Frank Hogan, Cardinal Spellman, Rose Schneiderman, Clara Lemlich, Norman Thomas. And you look at all that and you think, what the hell happened? I know in the last presidential election, both candidates were officially New Yorkers, but it just doesn't seem the same somehow.
It doesn't seem the same. I have a feeling that when people are seated here 50 years from now, they may not read a list like that, or, but that's one of the reasons why the era so fascinates me and why I continue to write about it, because of these characters. And so many of the names that you just listed would not be remembered by a fair number of New Yorkers. And in some ways that's good, because one of the beauties of New York is that it's ever-changing. We're getting new immigrants in all the time. But as a historian, I think it's my mission to try to entertain, but also educate new generations of New Yorkers, even those of us who have escaped to New Jersey, I do identify as a New Yorker. I just want you to know. I don't pay New York taxes, which I'm sure the governor would be happy to accept from me, but I do think that the story of New York in its glory years needs to be told and told again and told again, because I'm an optimist. I'm convinced that maybe not today, but someday there will be a list like that, and people will say, wow, yeah, those were the days.
Well, as someone who was born in New Jersey, I will cast no stones. But at another point, you mentioned Franklin Roosevelt corresponding with Babe Ruth.
Yes.
Terrific anecdote, who endorsed Al Smith. And it made me think of something I once read about, maybe apocryphal, but about how Katharine Hepburn visited FDR at Hyde Park. And she had a seaplane put her down on the Hudson, then took off her shoes and waded over to where Roosevelt was waiting in that great big blue Phaeton convertible. You read that, you think, like, are we living in the dullest time in American history?
Well, the great thing, I really do want to believe that story, Kevin, so don't tell me it's apocryphal. I think it's fact.
It's like somehow Kid Rock visiting Donald Trump doesn't quite live up to it, you get to tell two extraordinary life stories in this book, which I would think must have been a huge challenge as well as a joy. First, there's Al Smith, who is maybe the greatest story in American politics of a man just pulling himself up from nothing through constant hard work in that realm.
Yeah. When he died, his obituary in the New York Times said that there has never been a story like Al Smith in American politics. That we've had plenty, I'm paraphrasing the Times' prose, which is probably a mistake because it's so much better. But they basically said, we've had plenty of poor boys rise up from small towns and rural areas and rise to the top. But we've never, I think they used the phrase, well, the implication was, a little city kid, from the streets, rise up and almost get to the top. And it's still true. I mean, I don't know today. I mean, I'm sure there are people in local politics who come from a background like Al Smith's. But in terms of our national leaders, there aren't too many.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's people hear today that Al Smith was the first Catholic president nominee from a major party. I don't think they grasp just how alien and threatening he must have seemed to much of the country then, coming from where he did. And this is not to make any comparisons between the two individuals whatsoever, except that in terms of a culture shock, this would have been almost as if the Democrats were to nominate Jay-Z as president today, right? As far as the way that much of America saw it, right?
Well, sure. I mean, we forget in our ecumenical or sort of ecumenical times in the 21st century that to be a Catholic in 1928 was very exotic. Not New York, of course, because it was New York. But when Smith campaigned in Oklahoma, the Klan came out and burned crosses. The reason the second Klan, Klan 2.0, was revived in the late teens and early 20s is not because of African Americans, because they had been utterly oppressed already. It was because of Catholics and Jews coming to power in places like New York. And the Klan, and a lot of it had to do with Prohibition too, of course, but there was this notion that Al Smith could not possibly be a good president because he didn't understand liberty, which was a Protestant idea. This was mainstream language back then, that America was a Protestant country, that its freedoms were born of a Protestant God, and that all these Catholics and Jews were a threat to their identity. So, and Smith, the 1928 campaign was one of the ugliest in American history, and that is a rather large statement, I'm aware, but it was. Well, what Al Smith had to go through in 1928 was horrendous, and I think embittered him the rest of his life, because he grew up on the Lower East Side. Like, he saw lots of different people, but they didn't in Oklahoma.
And that's the thing too. He dresses unlike what's considered mainstream America. He talks in this New York patois. He doesn't. He's not some suburbanized, deracinated Catholic either.
No.
He's like right from the heart of the city, and this is stunning. And one of the great things you have in this book too, besides the prose, is the pictures. And you have a wonderful picture of Katie Smith, his wife, up at Hyde Park for some women's political meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt and a bunch of other women. And, she has this hat on that just looks bizarre. I mean, she looks like she's wearing like a grenadier's helmet. You can't really see her face. And, she had been this lovely young woman and really was the woman who, person who got Al into politics and all this. But, you could see how out of place she looked at the politics for the time. And the 28 campaign was really cruel for her.
Yes.
Well,
She was attacked bitterly because of her appearance, because of the way she dressed, because of the jewelry she wore. I think, I forget, there was some opposition pamphlet that said, "Could you imagine this woman in the White House?" So she suffered the slings and arrows of bigots as well. But you mentioned that photograph in which Eleanor Roosevelt is also in, and which sort of reminds me that Eleanor Roosevelt had a wonderful relationship with both Al and Katie Smith. She was very generous to Katie Smith. I think she understood. Eleanor, being a reluctant public figure herself,
Right.
I think she understood Katie's discomfort. Katie Smith was not Eleanor Roosevelt by any means, but they shared a shyness. And I think she understood that. But furthermore, one of the things that struck me about researching this book is that you really can't tell the story of the Roosevelts without telling the story of the Smiths. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt comes out as a public figure to campaign for Al Smith. Right? That's her first campaign, 1922, and then in 1924, she campaigns for Al Smith against her cousin, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., right? So even Eleanor is entwined in this story. And I think that, a lot of Roosevelt biographers, who are all wonderful, but maybe could have given a little bit more consideration, I think. Well, maybe I'm glad they didn't, because then I wouldn't have had a book to write.
And yes, and yet that wonderful story where she says, after the 1928 election, in which Al Smith is defeated, and her husband is elected governor of New York, she says, well, she doesn't really care about that so much, because what does it matter if Al Smith off at the top of the ticket?
Right. She was more upset. In fact, she didn't really even care that Franklin won. She was that upset that Al Smith, who had become a hero to her, had lost, and lost so bitterly.
What do you think it was that made Al Smith decide to sit down and not just be kind of a Tammany decoration, but to really learn the business of politics in Albany, to really study these bills and find out what was going on and become the master of the legislature that he became?
He was embarrassed, I think. His first 2 years in the legislature, at one point he wanted to give up. I mean, he was chosen by his local district leader, Tom Foley, for whom Foley Square is named. Tom Foley picked him out and went to Charlie Murphy and said, "Here's a good man for your assembly." He goes there, and at one point he says, "I never knew there were so many laws." He didn't really talk like that, but that's my rough impression of him, right? And and he's just overwhelmed with this. And at one point, he goes down by the Hudson River with another Tammany assemblyman and says to him, "Who ever thought that we were assemblymen, right? That we could do this?" And he sits down with Tom Foley at one point and says, "I'm just not cut out for this. What else do you have for me?" Because he's Tammany, so he can get him another job. So he offers him some sort of nice clerkship somewhere in the municipal building, maybe, or wherever. And then at one point, Smith decides no, and he writes later, "I didn't want to admit defeat. I didn't want to admit that there was something I couldn't do." So he goes back, and Frances Perkins' enduring memory of Al Smith, when she goes to Albany to lobby for the 54-hour work bill, she goes to the chamber, the assembly chamber, which hasn't changed, hasn't been cleaned since then, and is looking at all these Tammany assemblymen, or rather all of these assemblymen, and they're off gossiping and undoubtedly smoking cigars, because that's what they did indoors for years, and sees this lone figure at his desk working. And he says, she says to her colleague, "Who's that?" And the colleague says, "Oh, that's Al Smith. He's reading the legislation." Like, yeah, can you believe that? By the way, show of hands, how many people here think that anybody reads legislation today?
Yeah, in a way, they almost invented the three men in the room in Albany. He and Robert Wagner and the governor. And it's sort of, so maybe at the bottom of this all was a certain grit, and you get the feeling it's the same thing with FDR coming out of this kind of elite background. I mean, in a town where people used to literally doff their hats, workmen doff their caps, as you mentioned here, when the family went by, and coming to this place, and having initially, I think, this romantic notion that he was going to be like his distant cousin Teddy and follow the same steps, but really getting down to it and learning to be an effective politician.
Right.
And that's...
I think, of course, there's a lot to be said for two things two things that are part of the Roosevelt narrative, right? He contracts polio, or we now think that it wasn't polio, but there's no question he lost the use of his legs, and Eleanor's influence, right? That taught him empathy. Eleanor was his eyes and ears after he contracted polio, and that made him a changed man. I mean, Roosevelt later on in his life said to Frances Perkins, "Wow, I was a mean cuss when I was in Albany." And he was. He was not well liked. Nobody was unhappy to see Franklin Roosevelt go to Washington in 1913. But I do think that he learned a certain empathy from Tammany, from some of the characters he dealt with many years later. And you know what? I remember this quotation, which I stumbled across. I didn't discover it, but I've seen it quoted in other places. He's philosophizing. Roosevelt is president. He's philosophizing with Frances Perkins, remembering the old days. And he says, out of nowhere, according to Perkins, I'm not going to try to imitate Franklin Roosevelt. Al Smith I can do. I feel closer to him. But he basically says, Francis, Big Tim Sullivan taught me something about politics. He said that the future of this country is with people who came over in steerage. And they know the difference between being liked and being despised. And he said, Tim Sullivan was right about the human heart. So there's all sorts of things we could unpack about that in today's politics as well as yesterday's. But one of the things that I was struck by is that Franklin Roosevelt is quoting Big Tim Sullivan, who ran the rackets in the Bowery while he was state senator, and quoting him as wise, and quoting him as having a legitimate insight into who we are as a country. The people know the difference between being liked and despised. And they're the people whose ancestors came over, in the bowels of those ships. So I think that shows that these ruffians, as Frances Perkins called them, these ruffians taught Franklin Roosevelt a lot about politics and the human condition and how to get things done.
And the very interesting thing is, too, that Big Tim Sullivan with Al Smith and Robert Wagner are really the people who change over Tammany Hall.
Yes.
And make it a supporter of kind of this new liberalism. And this is really suicidal for the machine, in a way. You could get almost anything in New York as a privilege under the machine back in the day. But now you're actually going to get things as rights, often under programs they pass. And after that, there's really no need for the machine again.
No, there isn't. Obviously, if you have an entitlement, you don't need to go to Charlie Murphy and ask for help. All right, if you set up a social welfare network, there's no need per se for the machine. I mean, I would argue that there still is a need for contact between voters and their local politicians. There should be more of it, not less of it. But you don't need to go to your local district leader if you're in trouble. You can go to this social welfare system that I believe that Tammany and people like Al Smith had a lot to do with creating, and obviously Franklin Roosevelt, sealed the deal.
Yeah, pushed it through and got
Yeah.
it done. But that's an interesting thing. And yet, throughout Al Smith's career, as you make clear, the machine keeps kind of coming back to grab at him and almost pull him back. Like in the whole Sulzer fiasco, which is funny in some ways. This is governor who was a Tammany guy through and through, and he decides once he's in Albany that he's his own man, and he's going to be complete. He's not going to name any of these Tammany appointments. It got made into the wonderful Preston Sturges film, The Great McGinnity, if you've ever seen it. But Murphy orders Al Smith and Robert Wagner to deep six this
To
guy.
impeach him, right.
And-
The only impeachment in New York governor's gubernatorial history.
And he's no great loss, but it's something that costs them the leadership
Right.
of the legislature.
Yes, they
And
would
cost them,
Yeah, they were defeated in the next year, the legislature.
Yeah.
And but what's interesting about the Sulzer thing is that Tammany Murphy ordered an investigation of a proper investigation of Sulzer, and the Tammany chairs of this committee were shocked to discover that he was playing fast and loose with campaign funds. So this is clearly an impeachable offense. And by the way, he was. William Sulzer, who was elected in 1912 and then impeached in 1913, and that gave us Martin Flynn, the first Catholic governor of New York, who had been a lieutenant governor. But Sulzer was a crook. I mean, he deserved to be impeached, but, it was sort of like, okay, well, Tammany is impeaching him.
And that's kind of ultimately, it keeps coming back to hurt Al Smith. And even when he's doing it like he kind of finally, cuts, Roosevelt does that great interrogation of Jimmy Walker.
Yes.
And then Al Smith kind of goes to him, right? And what does he say? Like,
You're done, Jimmy.
You're done. And
You're
then
done.
and doesn't he say something too like, I'll run against you if you try to run again? And,
Yep.
and he asks on what ticket?
Right. And he says, I don't care, it's a Chinese laundry ticket, right? So, yeah,
I'll run
yeah.
against you.
Well, that was one of that was another favor that Al Smith did for FDR in 1932. I mean, the Jimmy Walker problem was a huge issue, right? Walker was up on corruption charges. He was a crook by then. Tammany had gone back to its old ways in 32, and people were writing, like Oliver Wendell Holmes and others were writing to FDR and saying, if you don't get rid of Jimmy Walker, you're not fit to be president. But meanwhile, Roosevelt is worried about losing Tammany support and losing New York. So Roosevelt has this inquiry of Jimmy Walker in the Red Room in the Capitol, and it doesn't go well for Walker. But it's now September. It's now late August of 1932, and the country literally is waiting to see what what Roosevelt is going to do with Jimmy Walker. Al Smith takes Walker to the plaza, sits down, and says, "You're done." And Walker resigned September 1st, 1932, and that ended Franklin Roosevelt's last possible faux pas to the presidency.
Yeah, and just to finish up then, and then the story kind of slides into tragedy for a while, just over FDR becomes president and is doing many of the things Smith had wanted done, and Smith is, I guess, consumed by his bitterness
Yes.
about the fact that he's not in this role,
Right.
and joins the Liberty League.
Yeah, I mean, he joins the Liberty League. Al Smith, of course, in the 1930s, campaigns for Alf Landon. That's a good cause. And Wendell Willkie, too, by the way. And, he does become more conservative. I think a lot of it has to do with jealousy. I think Al Smith definitely always underestimated Franklin Roosevelt. Eleanor once said it was kind of a reverse snobbery, that Al, the self-made, self-educated legislator, always looked down at the guy who got elected in 1910 because his name was Roosevelt. And I think there were a lot of things that made Smith bitter. One of them being is that he lost New York in 1928 in the presidential election as well. That made him very bitter. And he saw Roosevelt emerge as this great hero of his people, right? The working people of America now were looking to the Squire of Hyde Park. And I think it did drive him mad. So he broke with, he gives this crazy speech at the Liberty League where he basically accuses the New Deal of being a communist enterprise. But there is redemption in the end. And we're going to take questions in a second because I know I have to wrap up. But just to end it on a redemptive note, one of the things Al Smith saw immediately is the danger of Adolf Hitler. And through my research with the Times archives, I found that Smith gave a speech at Madison Square Garden filled to capacity with New York Jews who were very worried about Hitler. And here's the first Catholic presidential candidate who says, I don't care if you're wearing a brown shirt or you've got a white hood over your head, I know bigotry when I see it. And we're not going to allow this to happen in this country or hopefully anywhere else. So he is constantly sounding the alarm, Churchill-like in his own way, in New York about Hitler. And when Roosevelt is reelected for a third term in 1940 and is trying to change American foreign policy to make it more pro-allies, Smith is on board. And that is what broke the ice in their relationship, where Roosevelt writes to Smith and says, thank you. And then eventually says, do you want to come by? And Smith stops by the White House and then visits the White House 3 or 4 times in 1942, 43, and then Smith dies in 44. He dies right before the roses from Eleanor and Franklin arrive at St. Vincent's Hospital. So there is redemption at the end, and that's how we like all of our stories to end. And that's how this story is going to end, too.
Thanks very much. So I guess questions first.
And microphones.
Yeah. The lady there on the aisle?
That would be you.
Yeah. Here, let me.
Here we go.
Okay. There's one coming. Here you go.
I'm very curious about what made FDR a Democrat, since everyone in his social class was a Republican, including his cousin Theodore and Eleanor's family.
Well, the Hyde Park Roosevelts were Democrats. His father was a Grover Cleveland Democrat. Yeah, just by tradition, One of the things that I found striking is that Franklin Roosevelt's father, thought of Grover Cleveland as an ideal Democrat. And of course, Grover Cleveland and Franklin Roosevelt as presidents could not have been further apart, right? Grover Cleveland felt that, as many Gilded Age presidents did, that the government had no role in the economy. You had to let the market decide. That's what progressive Democrats in the Gilded Age believed. And that's why I think the party changes when Roosevelt and Smith find this common ground.
It's another fascinating thing about the 20s, just to put in, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. is also pursuing what he thinks is the Teddy ladder to success. He also is in the legislature. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he thinks he's going to become president. And you can imagine, it's as if suddenly these Republican Kennedys emerged, and they were actually more liberal than the Democratic Kennedys and stole all their thunder. It's such a fantastic moment in political history. And Al Smith kind of ends Teddy Jr.'s career by beating him for governor. He never runs again. Yeah, a lady there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Up until, I guess, the 1960s, liberal Democrats were stymied by Dixiecrats. And I wonder if either of you could say a few words about how Smith might have dealt, or even campaigning, he dealt with Dixiecrats, versus how Roosevelt, campaigning and then as president, dealt with Dixiecrats.
Well, I think he would have dealt with them the same way, in the sense that he needed their votes, right? In fact, Smith, because he was a Northern Catholic, nominated Senator Robinson from Mississippi or Arkansas, right? Arkansas, well done. Joseph Robinson. The solid South was not solid for Al Smith, right? That was one of the great, shocking things, that and the fact that New York wasn't either. But I think that they would have regarded the Southern Democrats as uncomfortable allies.
And it's one of the interesting things, you always hear about the court packing scheme kind of undoing Roosevelt supposedly. Really, one of the things that really hurt him was he attempted to get more liberal figures in the South
Right.
and elsewhere, mostly in the South in '38, and backed these relatively liberal primary people, took a real risk there and lost.
Right.
Got his head handed to him. Voters went for these horrible old troglodytes again, and then he had to back off and deal with these guys. But I've always kind of admired the fact that he was willing to kind of take that risk, and try to, okay, we're going to try to push things forward. And unfortunately, the people weren't ready.
In the Great Purge of 1938 that Kevin just referred to, which was a failure, except for one. One congressman was defeated, Congressman O'Connor from Manhattan, and Congressman Roosevelt had told Ed Flynn, go get him. He said, okay, I will, but you know what? You're going to lose all these other races. And Congressman O'Connor was Basil O'Connor's brother. Basil O'Connor, of course, was Roosevelt's law partner and the first chairman of the March of Dimes. Little trivia.
That's great. Yeah, who do we have? Sir. Yeah. We have a mic coming right here.
In 1932 convention, President Roosevelt defeated Al Smith for the nomination.
Yes.
Al Smith then became associated with a lot of very rich people and became head of the Empire State Building,
Mm-hmm.
was closely associated with John Raskob,
Mm-hmm.
and that what I've never seen any description of what the issues were that would have caused Al Smith, a traditional party-bearing Democrat, to leave the party so abruptly, to head a Liberty League attack on Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic parties in the very next convention. Can you go into that a little bit? and
Well,
explain?
yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. First of all, you're right. Smith had a very good job during the Depression, right? He's got a $50,000 a year job during the Depression, subsidized by the DuPonts as well, because the DuPonts have founded the Liberty League. I think there was jealousy of Roosevelt. I do think also there might have been some ideology. I mean, Al Smith was somebody who did believe in local government. He believed that state capitals were where these decisions should be made. So I think from an ideological point of view, I think he objected to some of the centralization that he saw in, as he called them, the alphabet agencies. I think there was part of that. But I think at the end of the day, it was just this bitterness that this figure he regarded as unworthy, who hadn't had to work a day in his life, again, he always underestimated him, had what he should have had. And I think he also felt that Roosevelt had blocked him. I think he would have felt in 1932, he had taken one for the team in 1928, and now the party owed him. That's certainly the way Bel Moskowitz felt, and many on his team, was that now Roosevelt was getting in his way. So, I mean, we like to think it's big ideas or bad ideas, but I think a lot of it had to do with personality.
But that doesn't speak too well to Smith, who was,
No, I agree.
as a loyalist of the Democratic Party,
I agree.
a standard
Right.
bearer
Yes.
of the Democratic Party.
Well,
Yeah.
And that's one of the intriguing what ifs, I think, in history. If Roosevelt had not been there, could Smith have been elected in '32?
It's unlikely.
Was the Depression bad enough?
I don't know. That is a great what
A lot
if.
of people, if you listen to Al Smith radio broadcasts, he sounds, radio.
Right.
It's not so much that he was a Catholic. It's that he was a Tammany New Yorker
Yeah.
that people in the country resented.
Right.
And I've often thought that was not really given a proper focus.
Right.
That thing. And his last meeting with Roosevelt, was it at the White House? And what was said, do we know?
Well, they were talking about, actually, we don't know. I mean, I can speculate, but we don't know. Yeah. A bunch of other questions here.
Hi, thank you. I look forward to reading your book. If you can elaborate on the effect that the Triangle Shirt Fire had, not just on Al Smith and Roosevelt, but maybe the nation, Francis Perkins, and,
Sure.
but especially Al Smith. I believe it was his assembly district.
It may have been, he certainly knew people. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in March of 1911 in the Village, in a building, the Ash Building, which still is there, part of NYU now. Of course, is one of the great milestones in American history, not just New York history. 146, most of them women, either burning to death, suffocating, or jumping to their deaths from the 9th floor and 8th floor of the factory. Smith was on that investigative committee. He was the vice chairman of the committee. Bob Wagner, like I knew him. Robert Wagner was the chairman of the committee, and Francis Perkins was among the advisors. That also was a bridge, because what Smith and Wagner did was they invited in reformers, civil service reformers, progressive reformers, who were never worked with Tammany before. But this united them, the outrage, over that tragedy. And that did shape Smith. Now remember, Smith is from the streets, and so is Wagner, right? Wagner was never poor like Smith was, but all of his siblings went out and worked when they were young, and his Bob Wagner's father was a janitor, worked $5 a week, so he knew what it was like. But when they went into those factories upstate, they saw things that they had never seen before. And they were profoundly shocked and profoundly motivated to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again.
Yeah, and this is, and they make a great point with that, and that's one of the things that's really interesting, because like the year before, there had been the uprising of the 20,000, the massive garment workers strike, mostly women, and that had been kind of the ugly side of Tammany, because they sent out not only the police to break it up, but they sent out the prostitutes and the pimps who the police controlled, and they attacked these women in the street, and then they jailed the strikers. So, you can see why the reformers were very leery of this organization, which was very conservative economically, and is really people like Smith and Wagner and Big Tim Sullivan who break that up and change that.
Sir?
Yeah.
And then this.
Unless you want to shout.
Thank you. This sort of follow-up to the question the gentleman in the first row really. We've heard, and I may have missed this in the earlier portion of this, but we know about the personal animus between, or the rift between the two men in the 1930s, after, really based on Smith's jealousy in seeing Roosevelt succeed where he didn't, okay, and succeeding him as governor, and then succeeding where he didn't, in the presidency. And there's an obvious tremendous difference in their socioeconomic standing and family background. But my question really is, to what extent did FDR actually publicly credit a lot of his New Deal programs and pushes to Al Smith? Because if I recall, I haven't read either Happy Warrior or Empire State or really any real bios of FDR, but in The Power Broker and the bio of Robert Moses, Caro says that in a conversation, I think, with Francis Perkins, FDR admits to her that everything we're doing now in D.C., Al Smith laid the blueprint for in the mid-1920s as governor and as an assemblyman. So the question really is, how did he do this publicly? Did he ever give Al Smith his due in a public way?
No, he did after Smith died. In 1944, Smith had died in September or October. Yeah, October. Thank you, Ambassador. And Roosevelt is now giving his closing argument. He speaks at Fenway Park. Like that, huh? You like that? Okay. And he delivers this moving tribute to Al Smith. And he reminds the people in Boston that he had come up and campaigned in 1928 for Al Smith. Even though Roosevelt himself was running for governor, he also campaigned for Smith in Boston. And he reminds his audience, because he's a great politician, of all that Al Smith did, all that Al Smith meant to the Massachusetts Irish, or the Massachusetts citizenry, or the Massachusetts Irish, whichever you choose, because they were both. But it's quite eloquent. And then he says, the America that Al Smith fought for is now, fighting for freedom. And he says, the Kowalskis, and he goes down, the laundry list of ethnic names. basically saying we're now all together in this great struggle for the things that Al Smith stood for. It's quite a beautiful, moving tribute by Roosevelt. And now, he knows his audience. Massachusetts loved Al Smith as much as New York did, except that Massachusetts voted for Al Smith for president. Now, this gentleman in the red has been very patient.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Go ahead. Well, wait for Mike. Wait for Mike.
Thank you.
Sure.
Could you basically define, ideologically speaking, the difference between a turn-of-the-century progressive versus a turn-of-the-century liberal, and why Teddy Roosevelt would be the enemy of liberals, for example? And just quickly, why did Al Smith lose New York in 1928 so badly?
That's an easier question. Well, I think he lost, remember, he was governor of New York. To lose your state, I mean, you've got no chance if you lose your home state to be Oh, right. Mind you, Woodrow Wilson lost New Jersey in 1916. So there's another bit of trivia for you. But Smith, I think, lost because there was a larger turnout upstate. And while he was loved upstate, he was also feared upstate. There was an active, there were active prohibitionists up there. There were Klansmen. Binghamton was the capital of New York's Klan. And when Roosevelt goes up, while he's campaigning, another great profile and courage of Franklin Roosevelt on Smith's behalf, when Roosevelt is campaigning for governor, he is in Klan country. He's in Broome County, upstate. And he basically says, you know, I have seen the most vile literature against Governor Smith. And if that's how you feel, not only should you not vote, you should be sent on a ship away from these shores. It's a brilliant, angry, it's a Franklin Roosevelt you don't see too often. He was furious at what he saw upstate directed against Governor Smith. So I think the anti-Catholic, the pro-prohibition, and the Klan element upstate was awakened by the prospect of Al Smith being president. So I think that's the answer. The progressive liberal, I mean, I would argue that the progressives of the early 20th century had a very moralistic view. They felt that the poor, had to be the deserving poor. You know, Frances Perkins talks about when she was a social worker, she wanted to find help for somebody, and they said, well, this woman, a widow with 2 children, she's not deserving. You know, she's not deserving. So she went around the corner to the local Tammany Hall, the McManus Clubhouse, which is still there. And she said, and they said, do you live in the district? And she said, well, they do. So, okay, come and see me in the morning. So progressivism had this moralism to it that I think liberalism did not have.
Just to finish up, but also just to add one point on that, we forget how popular Herbert Hoover was.
Oh, that's also
true. He was immensely
Yes.
popular.
Yes.
He was somebody who had also come from nothing. He had become, he was widely touted as having the highest salary of anybody in the world. He was seen as a huge business success. And he probably did save more people directly from starvation than anybody else in world history. So he was seen as tremendously successful. He was actually a little to the left of Al Smith on some issues. His was a real tragedy, too, in that time. But we forget that nobody was going to beat Herbert Hoover in 1928, no matter who they ran. And it's a shame that Al Smith got so smeared in that campaign, and it was so dirty, but it was, nobody was going to win that year.
Right. I think we only have time for one more question, and sorry. I haven't looked to my right. I'm sorry. I generally don't move to my right. But I'm a journalist, so none of you heard that. I'm an enemy of the people. Yes.
In 1961, the Tammany Hall rejected Robert Wagner as mayor to run for mayor and nominated Arthur Levitt. In the elections that year, Wagner ran as a reformer. Ed Koch beat Carmine DeSapio for leadership in the village, and Tammany Hall was basically finished.
Right.
If Tammany Hall still had any power in 1964, would they have allowed Robert Kennedy to run for the Senate as a carpetbagger?
If they thought he could win.
There's There's a great story about that, which is, one of the Eleanor Roosevelt was really determined to go after Tammany in part because they had kind of deep sixed her son, FDR Jr.
Right.
in New York when he was trying to run for governor. And her remark, she was one of the leaders. Koch was a very reluctant follower, but she was a very much one of the leaders in that 61 race. And she had this great comment afterwards. She said, I told Carmine I would get him, and get him I did.
Thank you. You can't follow that. Thank you very much.
Go upstairs and buy books. Thanks for coming out.